You're watching a war film, a cop show, maybe an air traffic control documentary, and someone says it. Roger that. Clear, crisp, confident, and you never once stop to ask why. Not understood, not got it, not yes. Roger, a man's name, a completely random man's name, dropped into one of the most critical communication systems ever built by human beings, and nobody bats an eye. Here's what's wild. That word has traveled from Morse code to military radio to NASA mission control to your favorite Netflix thriller, and almost nobody alive today knows the actual story behind it. It has survived wars, technological revolutions, and the complete overhaul of global communication systems. It outlived the very reason it was invented, and it's still here. This is exactly the kind of thing Behind Ordinary Things was built for. The stuff hiding in plain sight that turns out to have a history richer than most things we deliberately study. If this is your first time here, do yourself a favor and hit that subscribe button right now, because we do this every single time. We take the ordinary and pull the thread until something extraordinary comes out. Let's get into it. The problem with human voice over radio was serious enough to change language itself. To understand why Roger exists, you first have to understand the environment that created it. Early radio communication in the 1920s and 1930s was not the clean, crisp audio you get in your earbuds today. It was static, interference, overlapping frequencies, and partial transmissions. Pilots communicating with ground control, soldiers radioing commands across battlefields, and naval officers coordinating at sea were all operating in acoustic chaos. The single biggest danger in that environment was not enemy fire or bad weather, it was miscommunication. A pilot who mishears an altitude instruction doesn't get a second chance to clarify. A soldier who catches only half an order can get an entire unit killed. The margin for error in high-stakes radio communication is essentially zero, and early radio gave operators very little margin to work with. So the people responsible for military and aviation communication did something deliberate. They built a standardized language, a phonetic alphabet, designed specifically to survive noise, distortion, and poor signal. Every letter needed to be represented by a word that was acoustically distinct from every other word. No two letters could sound similar enough to cause confusion, even in the worst conditions. The phonetic alphabet didn't start with Alpha, Bravo, Charlie. It started somewhere much more interesting. Most people assume the NATO phonetic alphabet, Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, is the original. It isn't. It was adopted in 1956 after years of international coordination. Before that, the Allied nations, particularly the United States military, used what was called the Able Baker Alphabet, officially adopted in 1941. In that system, R was represented by the word Roger. Why Roger? Well, purely for phonetic clarity. Roger is two distinct syllables, begins with a hard consonant, and, it sounds nothing like words representing other letters. In noisy radio conditions it was reliable, it really stood out. That was the entire criterion. But, here's where it gets more interesting. Within that same communication framework, operators needed a way to confirm that a transmitted message had been successfully received. They needed a short, unambiguous acknowledgement signal, and the letter R, standing for received, was the natural choice. In Morse code, which actually predated voice radio, a single R had already been used as an acknowledgement symbol. When voice radio came in, operators simply carried the habit over. They said the phonetic word for R, which in their alphabet was Roger, to mean received. As the Oxford Companion to World War II documents, standardized military communication protocols were critical infrastructure during the conflict, developed not for convenience, but out of operational necessity. The acknowledgement systems built in that period shaped communication habits that, persisted for decades. Roger meaning received spread faster than the alphabet that created it. Here's the irony at the center of this whole story. In 1956, when NATO updated the phonetic alphabet to the version we use today, the letter R was reassigned. R no longer stood for Roger. R became Romeo. The word Roger was officially retired from the phonetic alphabet, but by then, it was honestly too late. Roger as a confirmation phrase had already embedded itself into military culture, aviation culture, and through film and media, into popular culture at large. The word had detached from its original technical function and taken on a life of its own. It no longer meant R for received in any technical sense, it simply meant message received and understood. And well, everyone knew it. This is a fascinating linguistic phenomenon, where technical shorthand outlives its own technical reason for existing. The tool persisted after the toolbox it came from was replaced. Aviation took Roger and made it permanent infrastructure. Civilian and military aviation was the environment where Roger became truly cemented. The Federal Aviation Administration and its predecessors built their communication protocols directly on military radio procedures, and Roger came with them. Flight crews, air traffic controllers, and ground personnel were all trained in the same acknowledgement vocabulary. The reason aviation held onto it so tightly is practical. Aviation communication is not casual. Every word in a radio exchange between a pilot and a tower has a specific, agreed-upon meaning. There is no room for yeah, got it, or sounds good. Standardized phrasing eliminates ambiguity and reduces the cognitive load on both ends of the transmission. When a controller clears a pilot to descend and the pilot says Roger, both parties know exactly what was communicated and confirmed. No interpretation required. The United States Aeronautical Information Manual, which governs pilot communication standards, has included Roger in its approved phraseology for decades. It's formally defined as meaning, I have received all of your last transmission. And, it's worth noting the precision here. Not orjal the darber zonikun sen. Just, I heard you, but specifically that the entire transmission was received. So, why not just say understood? Well, there's a real answer to this. Understood is actually an approved word in radio communication. NATO and many military manuals make a distinction between Roger, Wilco, and understood, since they serve slightly different functions. Roger confirms receipt of a message. Wilco, which is short for will comply, confirms receipt and also communicates intent to carry out an instruction. And then understood is used to confirm that the meaning of a message has been grasped, not just that the transmission was received. In everyday usage, people say Roger that instead of understood for a much simpler reason, cultural penetration. Decades of military films, television dramas, documentaries, and news coverage have, repeatedly exposed civilian audiences to military and aviation communication culture. The phrase became a cultural artifact. It carries connotations of professionalism, precision, and authority that understood just doesn't have in casual use. Saying Roger that in a conversation signals awareness, decisiveness, and a certain kind of confident competence. It's become, linguistic shorthand for I'm the kind of person who communicates clearly. Roger also became a verb, which tells you everything about how embedded it got. Language evolves in predictable patterns. When a word becomes culturally dominant, it expands grammatically. Roger did exactly that. NASA and space exploration gave Roger its most iconic moments. If aviation embedded Roger in professional communication culture, NASA launched it into the cultural stratosphere. Literally. The Apollo missions were broadcast to a global audience, and the communication style between mission control and astronauts became one of the most listened-to radio exchanges in human history. Roger. Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. that phrase, or ones very much like it, were transmitted from Houston and heard by hundreds of millions of people during the Apollo 11 landing in 1969. NASA communication protocols were built directly on military and aviation standards. Roger was standard vocabulary, and because those missions were cultural landmarks, the phrases associated with them became permanently woven into global consciousness. The phrase survived into a world where the technology that created it is almost unrecognizable. Modern digital communication has largely eliminated the noise and interference problems that made phonetic alphabets and standardized acknowledgments necessary in the first place. And yet, Roger persists. Professional aviation still uses it because the tradition of standardized communication is itself a safety feature. Consistency in phrasing reduces error. The story of Roger is really a story about how human beings build systems to compensate for the limits of their own communication. Next time someone says Roger that in a meeting or a movie or a conversation, you'll know exactly where it came from, and why it's still here. That's what this channel is about. If you got value out of this, share it with someone who would appreciate it, and if you haven't subscribed yet, this is your reminder. Hit subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.